Millionaire came to donate, but was shocked when staff pushed his long-lost pregnant wife away because they had no money. Hi, my beautiful and loyal family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. Every time I see your comments, your words, and feel your love, my heart swells with gratitude beyond what I can say. You are not just watchers. You are the soul and heartbeat of this channel, the reason I pour my heart into every story I tell. Thank you for standing with me through every chapter, every twist, every moment. Your loyalty is a precious gift I hold close, and I vow to always honor it with all I have. I want to thank you deeply for helping us reach 25,000 followers. This milestone belongs to every one of you. Without your support, love, and trust, I am nothing. To all the new family members who have joined us recently, welcome. You found a home here, a place where your heart can feel safe and your spirit uplifted. Please stay with us until the very end of every story. You'll soon understand why this family means so much. And to my steadfast, faithful warriors, you are my strength and light. Please, share in the comments how much this family means to you so our new members can feel the warmth, love, and trust that binds us all. From the depths of my soul, I ask, if you love these stories, if you feel this connection, please don't wait for me to ask. Like and comment. Let me see your love shine brightly by writing, I am here. Together we rise. Together we build a community filled with respect, love, and belonging. Thank you for being my family, my heart, my everything. Without you, I am nothing. Now let's dive into today's story with all my love. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the downtown coffee shop like 1,000 desperate fingers, each drop carrying the weight of autumn's melancholy. Mark Fisher sat alone in the corner booth, his 6-foot frame folded into the worn leather seat as if he were trying to disappear entirely. At 32, he possessed everything society equated with masculine success. Fisher Technologies, the AI company he'd inherited and grown into a $15 billion empire. Penthouses in New York, London, and Tokyo, a collection of Ferraris and Lamborghinis that automotive journalists called obscene, and a face that regularly graced magazine covers with headlines like Tech's Most Eligible Bachelor. Yet beneath the expensive veneer, he felt like a corpse in an Armani suit, each achievement another layer of gilding on a fundamentally empty existence. His fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug, seeking warmth that seemed to elude him no matter how hot the coffee. The liquid had gone cold an hour ago, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Around him, the cafe buzzed with the comfortable chatter of couples sharing intimate conversations, friends laughing over shared memories, and students buried in textbooks with dreams still intact. Mark felt like a ghost haunting their world, present but not really there, watching life happen to everyone else, while his own existence felt like a carefully orchestrated performance. The weight of inherited expectations pressed down on his shoulders like atmospheric pressure at crushing depths. Jonathan Fisher had founded Fisher Technologies 40 years ago with nothing but algorithms and ambition, building it into an AI empire that now powered everything from autonomous vehicles to medical diagnostics. Mark had inherited the company at 25 when his father died of a heart attack, spending the last 7 years growing it from a $12 billion corporation into the $15 billion technological giant it was today. But every innovation felt hollow because he was expanding someone else's vision rather than creating his own, a custodian of genius rather than a genius himself. The board meetings, the galas, the endless parade of people who wanted pieces of him, all felt like elaborate theater where he played a role he'd never auditioned for. His mother's voice echoed in his mind like a familiar poison. You have everything, Mark. Stop wallowing in self-pity. But Evelyn Fisher had never understood that having everything meant nothing when you felt fundamentally unworthy of love. She saw his wealth and power as validation, while Mark saw them as proof that people only valued what he could give them. Never who he was, beneath the expensive suits and calculated smiles. The bell above the cafe door chimed, cutting through his brooding like a knife through silk. Mark looked up and felt the world tilt on its axis. She moved like liquid poetry, her natural hair framing her face in a glorious crown of curls that caught the cafe's warm lighting like a halo. Her skin was the color of rich caramel, and she wore a simple blue dress that somehow made every other woman in the room fade into background noise. But it wasn't her beauty that stopped Mark's breath. It was the way she carried herself, as if she owned every space she entered, not through arrogance, but through an unshakable sense of self-worth that radiated from her like warmth from a fire. Christine Spencer, 28 years old and carrying the weight of 1,000 broken children on her shoulders, had been running late for her meeting with a potential foster family. Her mind raced with the case of another child who needed a safe home. The rain had soaked through her coat, and exhaustion pulled at her bones from another 18-hour day, fighting a system that seemed designed to fail the children she'd devoted her life to protecting. She ducked into the coffee shop seeking 5 minutes of peace and a hot drink to chase away the chill that seemed to live in her bones these days. Her eyes swept the crowded cafe, looking for an empty table when they landed on him. The man in the corner booth sat like a king in exile, his expensive clothes unable to hide the profound sadness that surrounded him like a visible aura. She'd seen that look countless times in her work, the expression of someone who'd lost faith in their own worth, but never had it struck her so powerfully. Something about his pain called to her own, recognizing a kindred spirit in the midst of a crowded room. Their eyes met across the cafe, and the world seemed to pause. Time suspended itself. Conversations faded to whispers, and the only sound either of them could hear was the thundering of their own hearts. Mark felt something shift inside his chest, as if a key had turned in a lock he'd forgotten existed. The hollow ache that had been his constant companion suddenly filled with something he couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or recognition, or the terrifying possibility that he might not be as broken as he'd always believed. Christine felt the impact of his gaze like a physical force. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, dark gray with flecks of silver that seemed to hold entire universes of pain and longing. She'd built walls around her heart after too many disappointments, too many men who saw her as an exotic conquest rather than a complete human being. But something about this stranger's vulnerability made those walls tremble. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that surprised her. "Is this seat taken?" Mark looked down at the empty space across from him, then back up at her face, and felt his carefully constructed world begin to crumble. "No," he managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Please." She slid into the booth with fluid grace, and Mark caught the scent of her perfume, something warm and spiced that made him think of autumn evenings and promises whispered in the dark. Up close, she was even more devastating. Her skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and when she smiled, he felt something inside his chest crack open like an egg, revealing new life. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world," she said, her voice soft but direct. There was no judgment in her tone, only the kind of recognition that comes from someone who understood what it meant to feel responsible for more than one person should bear. "And you look like someone who knows what that feels like," he replied, surprising himself with his honesty. Something about her presence made pretense feel impossible. Christine studied his face, seeing past the expensive haircut and designer clothes to the boy underneath, the one who'd learned too young that love was conditional, that worth had to be earned rather than simply accepted. "I work with children in the foster system," she said. "You see a lot of broken people in that world, people who've forgotten they deserve love just for existing." Mark's breath caught. "And what do you tell them?" "That worth isn't something you earn," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "It's something you're born with. It can't be taken away by other people's failures to see it." The words hit him like physical blows, each one finding marks he'd thought were hidden from the world. What if they've spent so long believing they're worthless that they can't remember how to feel any other way? Christine reached across the small table, her fingers brushing his with a touch so gentle it might have been accidental, but the electricity that passed between them was anything but. And then someone who sees their worth has to remind them over and over until they start to believe it themselves. Mark stared down at their joined hands, his pale and soft from a life of privilege, hers darker and bearing the small scars that came from real work in a harsh world. The contrast should have reminded him of all the reasons they didn't belong together, but instead it felt like the completion of something he'd never known was incomplete. "I'm Mark," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Christine," she replied, and the way she said his name made it sound like a prayer. They sat in that small booth for 3 hours, the rain continuing its rhythmic dance against the windows, while they talked about everything and nothing. She told him about her work, about the children who taught her daily that resilience was stronger than trauma, about her belief that everyone deserved a safe place to call home. He found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, about the pressure of living up to impossible expectations, about the loneliness that wealth couldn't touch, about the way success felt like a beautiful prison when you had no one to share it with. "I've never met anyone like you," Mark said, as the cafe began to empty around them. "You make me feel like I might actually be worth something." "You are worth something," Christine said fiercely, her eyes blazing with the kind of conviction that moved mountains. "You're worth everything, and someday you're going to believe that yourself." When they finally stood to leave, neither wanted the moment to end. The rain had stopped, and the city lights painted the wet streets in shades of gold and silver. Mark walked her to her car, a 10-year-old Honda that had seen better days but was meticulously maintained, and felt like a different man than the one who'd entered the cafe hours earlier. "Can I see you again?" he asked, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Christine smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise after the longest night of his life. "I'd like that very much." As she drove away, her taillights disappearing into the night, Mark stood on the sidewalk feeling reborn. For the first time in his adult life, he believed he might actually deserve love, and for the first time ever, he wanted to fight for it. Chapter 2. Forbidden Fire. 3 days passed before Mark found the courage to call her. 3 days during which he carried her business card in his pocket like a talisman, his fingers tracing the simple embossed letters of her name until they were worn smooth. He'd built a $15 billion empire through decisive action, but asking a woman for dinner had reduced him to a teenager practicing conversations in front of his bathroom mirror. When he finally dialed her number, his hands trembled with the vulnerability of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to want something money couldn't buy. "Oh, Christine Spencer," her voice came through the phone, like warm honey poured over broken glass, instantly soothing and impossibly comforting. "It's Mark," he said, then immediately felt foolish for the inadequacy of the introduction. "From the coffee shop. I was wondering if you'd like to have dinner with me tonight." There was a pause that lasted only seconds but felt like hours. In that silence, Mark's imagination conjured a dozen rejections, each one confirming his deepest fear that their connection had been one-sided, that he'd projected meaning onto kindness and mistaken professional compassion for personal interest. "I'd love to," she said, and the warmth in her voice made his chest tighten with something he'd thought lost forever: hope. "But somewhere quiet," she continued. "I don't need photographers documenting my life or turning me into tabloid fodder." It was the first acknowledgement that she knew exactly who he was, and Mark's heart clenched with familiar dread. He'd learned, To expect the moment when genuine interest transformed into calculated pursuit, when people suddenly remembered his net worth and began editing their personalities accordingly. "You know about," he started, "about your money, your company, your face on magazine covers." Christine's laugh was soft but knowing, carrying no judgment or calculation. "Mark, honey, I work with wealthy donors all the time. I knew who you were the moment you sat down across from me. The question is, do you trust me enough to believe that's not why I'm here?" The vulnerability in her question gutted him completely. She was asking him to take a leap of faith that his entire life experience had taught him was foolish, dangerous, naive. But something about her voice, the absolute honesty in it, the lack of any agenda except genuine curiosity about who he was beneath the Forbes headlines, made him want to risk everything. "Yes," he said without hesitation, surprising himself with the certainty. "I do. Then pick me up at 7. And Mark, wear something that makes you feel like yourself, not like the CEO everyone expects you to be." When he arrived at her modest apartment building that evening, Mark had traded his usual designer armor for dark jeans and a simple black sweater. He felt exposed without his expensive clothes, stripped of the visual reminders of his success and power. But when Christine opened her door and her eyes lit up with genuine appreciation, he knew he'd made the right choice. She wore a flowing emerald dress that seemed to capture and reflect light, like liquid jewelry. Her natural hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and she'd applied just enough makeup to enhance her beauty without hiding the character lines that spoke of a woman who'd lived, struggled, and emerged stronger. When she smiled at him, Mark forgot how to breathe. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice catching slightly on words that felt inadequate to capture the effect she had on him. "So do you," she replied, and the way she said it, like she meant it, like she saw something in him worth appreciating beyond his bank account, made his chest tight with emotion he'd spent years suppressing. He took her to Lucia's, a small Italian restaurant on the outskirts of the city that his driver had to find using GPS. It was the kind of place that existed for locals, not tourists. Family-owned, cash-only, where the grandmother still made pasta by hand and the wine came in simple glasses that had seen decades of celebrations and heartbreaks. There were no paparazzi, no people who recognized him, just candlelight, and the soft murmur of couples lost in their own worlds. "Tell me about your work," Mark said once they'd settled into a corner booth that felt like their own private universe. Christine's face transformed when she talked about the children she fought for, her professional mask falling away to reveal passion that burned bright enough to light up the small restaurant. Her eyes blazed with righteous fury as she described 8-year-old Deshawn, who'd been in the system for 3 years, but still believed every adult who promised they'd take care of him. She spoke about twin sisters who held hands in their sleep, because they were terrified of being separated, and teenage boys who acted tough but still needed someone to tell them they mattered. "The system is broken," she said, her hands moving expressively as she painted pictures with words. "We have children aging out at 18 with nowhere to go, no family, no support system, no preparation for the real world. We have babies born addicted to drugs because their mothers couldn't get treatment. We have kids who've been abused so badly they can't trust adults, but we keep moving them from home to home because we don't have enough resources for proper placement." Mark found himself leaning forward, captured not just by her passion, but by the way she talked about these children, like they were her own, like their pain was her pain, like their failures were personal defeats and their successes were victories. "Worth celebrating. What keeps you going?" he asked. "When the system fails them, when you can't save them all, what prevents you from burning out completely?" "Because for every 10 kids I can't help, there's one I can," she said simply. "And that one child gets to grow up knowing someone fought for them, someone believed they were worth saving. That's enough." The conversation flowed like water finding its natural course. Easy, inevitable, life-giving. She told him about growing up in foster care herself, about aging out at 18 with nothing but a social worker's business card and a fierce determination to make sure other children didn't suffer alone. He found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, about the crushing weight of inherited expectations, about the loneliness that came with having more money than most small countries, about the way success felt like a beautiful prison when you had no one to share it with. "I've never met anyone like you," Mark said, as their untouched dinner grew cold between them. "You make me feel like I might actually be worth something beyond my net worth." "You are worth something," Christine said fiercely, her eyes blazing with the kind of conviction that moved mountains. "You're worth everything, and someday you're going to believe that yourself." They barely touched their food, too lost in each other to remember something as mundane as eating. Mark discovered that Christine had a master's degree in social work, from Columbia, that she spoke 3 languages, that she could quote Maya Angelou from memory and had read everything Toni Morrison ever wrote. She learned that Mark had wanted to be a teacher before inheriting his father's empire, that he still coded for relaxation, that he'd memorized every word of The Princess Bride because it was the only movie that had ever made him laugh during his lonely childhood. When the restaurant began to empty around them, neither wanted the evening to end. Mark drove her home slowly, taking the long way through the city, both of them savoring every moment of connection that felt too precious to rush. Outside her apartment building, the air crackled with possibility. The streetlights cast everything in golden shadows, and the autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and promises yet to be made. They stood on her small porch, facing each other. The space between them electric with unspoken desires and carefully controlled longing. "I should go inside," Christine said, but she made no move to leave his presence. "You should," Mark agreed, but his hand found hers, their fingers intertwining like they'd been designed to fit together. "This is dangerous," she whispered, and he could hear her heart racing in the slight tremor of her voice. "Why?" "Because I could fall in love with you," she said, the words hanging between them like a confession and a warning all at once. Mark's heart stopped beating for a moment, then started again twice as fast. Would that be so terrible? "It would be everything," she said, and the weight of that truth settled over them both like a silk shroud that was both blessing and curse. When he walked her to her door, the space between them felt charged with enough electricity to power the city. They stood in the glow of her porch light, neither wanting to be the first to break the spell that had wrapped around them like magic. "Christine," Mark said, her name a plea and a prayer on his lips. She looked up at him, seeing past his wealth and status to the vulnerable man underneath, and felt her heart crack open completely. "Kiss me," she whispered. When their lips met, the world caught fire. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like they were afraid the other might disappear if they moved too quickly. But then Christine's hands fisted in his sweater and Mark's arms, wrapped around her waist, and the kiss deepened into something desperate and consuming, a claiming and a surrender all at once. It was a kiss that spoke of futures imagined and walls tumbling down. It tasted like wine and possibility, like all the words they hadn't yet found the courage to say, like the promise of healing for 2 people who'd given up on being loved for, who they truly were. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together as they tried to find their balance in a world that had suddenly shifted on its axis. "I'm falling," Mark whispered against her lips. "Me too," she breathed back, and they both knew they were talking about something far more dangerous than gravity. But even as they stood wrapped in each other's arms under the starlit sky, neither of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street, or the telephoto lens capturing every moment of their embrace. In the back seat, a private investigator named Davidson uploaded high-resolution photos to a secure server, each image time-stamped and GPS tagged for the client who was paying him $5,000 a day to document her son's inappropriate relationship. Evelyn Fisher received the photos within minutes, studying each one on her tablet with the cold calculation of a general planning a siege. Mark's face in the images showed happiness she hadn't seen since he was a child, and that happiness filled her with a rage so pure it felt like religious conviction. "Find out everything," she texted Davidson. "I want to know where she grew up, who she slept with, how much debt she has, what skeletons are hiding in her family closet. Everyone has secrets. Find hers." But as she scrolled through images of her son kissing a woman who clearly adored him, Evelyn realized that conventional ammunition might not be enough. Christine Spencer looked at Mark the way Evelyn had once looked at his father, with complete devotion and unconditional love. That kind of love created loyalty that was difficult to break through ordinary means. No, destroying this relationship would require something more sophisticated, more surgical, more devastating than simple character assassination. It would require making Mark doubt not just Christine, but his own judgment, his own worth, his own capacity to recognize genuine love when it was offered freely. Evelyn Fisher had not built a social empire by accepting defeat. If conventional weapons wouldn't work, she would simply have to create unconventional ones. And if her son insisted on choosing this woman over his family's wishes, then he would learn that some choices came with consequences that lasted forever. The war for Mark's soul had begun, though neither he nor Christine knew it yet. For now, there was only the fire between them, burning bright enough to light up the darkness and warm them both against the storm that was coming, a storm that would test whether love really could survive the systematic destruction of trust. Chapter 3. Sacred Vows, Hidden Daggers. 6 months of stolen moments had woven Mark and Christine's lives together like threads in an intricate tapestry. They met in secret, quiet restaurants on the edge of town, long drives along empty coastlines, weekends in his cabin by the lake where the world couldn't reach them. Each encounter deepened their connection. Each kiss wrote new chapters in a love story neither had believed possible. Mark had never experienced anything like the peace he found in Christine's arms. When she held him, the constant noise in his head finally quieted. Her touch rewrote every terrible thing he'd ever believed about himself, transforming his self-doubt into something that felt almost like self-love. She saw him, not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the man who woke up from nightmares about never being enough, who sometimes cried in the shower from the weight of everyone's expectations. "I love watching you sleep," Christine whispered one Sunday morning as sunlight streamed through the cabin windows. They lay tangled in white sheets, her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Why?" Mark asked, his fingers trailing through her hair like he was memorizing the texture. "Because that's when you look peaceful, like all the weight you carry just disappears." She pressed a kiss to his chest, right over his heart. "I wish you could see yourself the way I see you. How do you see me?" he asked, though part of him was afraid of the answer. "Perfect," she said without hesitation. "Broken and healing and absolutely perfect." It was that morning when Mark knew he couldn't live another day without her being completely his. "Marry me," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Christine lifted her head to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise and something that looked like joy. "Mark." "I know it's crazy. I know my mother will lose her mind, and the media will have a field day, and there'll be complications we can't even imagine. But I love you, Christine. I love you so much that everything else feels like background noise." His hands cupped her face, thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had started falling. "Marry me. Make me the luckiest bastard alive." Yes, she whispered, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, yes, of course, yes. They married 3 weeks later in a small chapel 2 hours outside the city, with only the pastor and his wife as witnesses. Christine wore a simple white dress she'd bought at a vintage shop, nothing expensive or elaborate, just something that made her feel beautiful. Mark wore the same dark suit he'd worn on their first date, the one that made him feel like himself, instead of the image everyone expected him to project. Do you, Mark Jonathan Fisher, take Christine Marie Spencer to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? I do, Mark said, his voice strong and sure, his eyes never leaving Christine's radiant face. Forever and always I do. Do you, Christine Marie Spencer, take Mark Jonathan Fisher to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part? I do, Christine said through tears of pure joy. With all my heart I do. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Mark kissed her like she was air, and he'd been drowning. The small chapel filled with their laughter and tears, and for a perfect moment, nothing existed except the two of them and the promises they'd just made. They honeymooned at the lake cabin, 5 days of uninterrupted bliss where they made love. Like it was their first time and their last time all at once. Mark had never felt such completeness, watching his wife make coffee in the morning light, her hair wild from sleep, wearing his shirt and nothing else. Mrs. Fisher, he said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. I love the sound of that, she murmured, leaning back against his chest. I love you, he said into her hair. God, Christine, I love you so much it terrifies me. Don't be terrified, she said, turning in his arms. Love is supposed to feel like flying. But even as they lost themselves in their private paradise storm, clouds were gathering in the world they'd left behind. Evelyn Fisher had discovered their secret marriage through the private investigator she'd hired to watch her son, and her rage was nuclear in its intensity. He married her, she said to her reflection in the mirror of her vast master bedroom, her voice deadly calm in the way that had made board members tremble for decades. That little gold-digging whore actually convinced him to marry her. Evelyn had built her life on control of her husband's empire, control of her social standing, control of her son's future. The idea that some nobody from the projects could waltz in and disrupt everything she'd worked for was unthinkable. If Mark thought he could defy her and live happily ever after, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized but hoped never to use. Mr. Chen, this is Evelyn Fisher. I believe it's time we discussed that special project we spoke about. David Chen was the kind of man who didn't officially exist. No business cards, no office, no paper trail. He specialized in problems that required creative solutions, and he'd solved several for Evelyn over the years. Corporate espionage dressed up as legitimate investigation, the ruin of business rivals through carefully planted evidence, the destruction of anyone who threatened her vision of how the world should work. What do you need? Chen asked in his carefully neutral voice. Complete background work on Christine Spencer, now Fisher. I want every secret she's ever had, every mistake she's ever made, every person she's ever known who might be willing to talk, and I want it all to look unquestionably legitimate. Budget? Unlimited. I want enough material to bury her so deep she'll never see sunlight again. And if there's nothing to find, Evelyn's smile was sharp enough to cut glass, then we create something. You've done it before. Meanwhile, Mark and Christine returned to the city glowing with newlywed happiness, blissfully unaware of the machinery already moving against them. They'd rented a small apartment under Christine's maiden name, a cozy space where they could be themselves without the pressure of Mark's public identity. It was there, 2 months after their wedding, that Christine made a discovery that filled their world with even more light. Mark came home from a day of board meetings to find his wife sitting on their bed, tears streaming down her face and something clutched in her trembling hands. "Baby, what's wrong?" he asked, rushing to her side, his heart hammering with instant panic. Wordlessly, she held up the pregnancy test, the 2 pink lines clear and unmistakable. For a moment, time stopped. Mark stared at the test, then at his wife's face, then back at the test. When the reality finally hit him, he let out a whoop of pure joy that probably woke the neighbors 3 floors down. "We're having a baby," he said in wonder, gathering Christine into his arms and spinning her around their small bedroom. "Babies," she corrected, laughing through her tears. "I went to the doctor today. It's twins, Mark. We're having twins." Mark fell to his knees in front of her, pressing his face against her still flat stomach. "Hey there, little ones," he whispered. "This is your daddy. I love you both so much already, and I promise I'm going to be the father you deserve. I'm going to protect you and love you and make sure you always know how wanted you are." Christine's hands are tangled in his hair as she looked down at this powerful man reduced to tears by the gift of their children. "Elijah and Isaiah," she said softly. "What?" Mark looked up at her through his tears. "Their names. If they're boys, Elijah and Isaiah. Strong names for strong boys. And if they're girls, then we'll figure it out together," she said, pulling him up to kiss her. Everything together, always. For the next few months, they lived in a bubble of pure happiness. Mark would come home from work and spend hours talking to Christine's growing belly, reading stories and playing classical music. He insisted would make their babies more intelligent. They painted a nursery in soft yellows and greens, argued sweetly over cribs and car seats, and dreamed about the family they were creating. But in the shadows, Evelyn's plan was crystallizing into something monstrous. Chen had assembled a team that read like a criminal's dream roster. Former NSA hackers who'd gone private, document forgers who'd learned their craft creating papers for international spies, and behavioral psychologists who specialized in gaslighting techniques that could make victims doubt their own memories. "The key is subtlety," Chen explained during a clandestine meeting in his downtown office. "We don't want to destroy her all at once. We want to plant seeds of doubt that will grow organically. Make Mr. Fisher question his own judgment, not just hers." "Timeline?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was planning. 6 months. Long enough to create a comprehensive false history. Short enough to strike while she's vulnerable with pregnancy hormones affecting her emotional stability. Evelyn signed the initial payment authorization, $2 million to purchase the destruction of her son's happiness. To her, it was the best investment she'd ever made. Chapter 4. The Perfect Frame. David Chen was an artist, and his medium was the systematic destruction of human happiness. In his nondescript office in downtown's financial district, officially registered as Strategic Consulting Solutions, he spread the fruits of 3 months' meticulous labor across a conference table like a general displaying battle plans. Bank statements, security footage, financial records, witness testimonies, psychological profiles. Every piece of evidence was a masterwork of fabrication, so perfect that forensic accountants would need electron microscopes to find the digital fingerprints. "Show me," Evelyn Fisher commanded, her manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany table with the rhythm of a heartbeat counting down to execution. She'd aged visibly since discovering Mark's marriage, her rage carving new lines around her eyes and mouth. But the aging wasn't from stress. It was from the constant effort of containing her fury while methodically planning the destruction of her son's happiness. Evelyn Fisher had not built a social empire by allowing emotions to compromise strategy. Chen activated a wall-mounted monitor displaying what appeared to be legitimate bank records from 3 different financial institutions. Phase 1 was Establishing the foundation, he began with the professional detachment of a surgeon describing a complex operation. We created a comprehensive financial history showing your daughter-in-law researching your son's net worth, his investment patterns, even his charitable giving, dating back 8 months before they officially met. The fabrication was breathtaking in its complexity. Chen's team had hacked into actual search engines and social media platforms, inserting phantom search histories and browsing patterns that would surface during any investigation. Christine Spencer's digital footprint now showed a woman obsessed with Mark Fisher's wealth, studying his public appearances, downloading his company's financial reports, even researching the market value of his art collection. Phase 2 involved establishing motive and method, Chen continued, bringing up a series of documents that made Evelyn's predatory smile deepen. We've created a parallel identity for your daughter-in-law, Keisha Johnson from Detroit, with a history of targeting wealthy men. Social media profiles going back 5 years, employment records, even high school yearbook photos digitally altered to match her appearance. The level of detail was staggering. Chen had hired method actors to create fake testimonials from Keisha's former victims, wealthy older men who'd been seduced and robbed by a woman, matching Christine's description. The testimonies were video recorded, complete with emotional breakdowns and specific details about her manipulative techniques. What about verification? Evelyn asked, studying the false identity materials with the appreciation of a connoisseur. The beauty of digital archaeology, Chen smiled, is that most people don't understand the difference between correlation and causation. We've embedded this false identity so deep into existing systems that it will surface naturally during any background investigation. Employment records in databases your son's investigators actually access, social media connections with people who genuinely exist and will unknowingly corroborate details of her manufactured past. But Evelyn's true genius lay not in the evidence itself, but in her understanding of her son's psychological architecture. She'd spent 32 years studying Mark's weaknesses, cataloging every insecurity, mapping every trigger point that could be exploited. The evidence had to be not just convincing, but overwhelming enough to bypass his analytical mind and strike directly at his emotional vulnerabilities. "Tell me about the timeline," she said, settling back in her chair like a director reviewing the script for her masterpiece. "The rollout begins next week with subtle inconsistencies," Chen explained, bringing up a detailed schedule. "Small withdrawals from his accounts that he won't immediately notice but will show up on monthly statements. Security badges being used during off hours when she's supposedly home with him. Credit card purchases that don't match her usual spending patterns." Evelyn nodded approvingly. This was exactly the approach Mark's business training had conditioned him to respect: systematic data analysis leading to inevitable conclusions. He would investigate each anomaly, find reasonable explanations, dismiss his concerns as paranoia, but the accumulation of small doubts would create the psychological foundation for accepting larger deceptions. "Phase 3 is the smoking gun," Chen continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of an engineer describing a perfectly designed machine. "We've arranged for your son to discover evidence that his wife has been systematically stealing from your family for months. Not all at once. That would seem suspicious. But piece by piece, building an undeniable pattern of betrayal." He clicked to a new presentation showing the crown jewel of their operation: security footage of Christine entering the Fisher Technologies building after hours, accessing Mark's private office, and transferring files to a flash drive. The video quality was perfect, the timestamps authentic, the behavior clearly criminal. "How?" Evelyn asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Deepfake technology normally used for Hollywood special effects." Chen said proudly. We hired an actress with similar build and movement patterns, filmed her performing the actions in a replica of your son's office, then used AI to replace her face with your daughter-in-law's. The result is indistinguishable from authentic surveillance footage, but the true masterstroke was still to come. Chen opened a leather case containing a diamond necklace worth $200,000, Evelyn's grandmother's Cartier piece, a family heirloom that had been prominently featured in society magazines for 3 generations. The jewelry will be planted during the family dinner you're hosting next week, Chen explained. We've already had duplicate keys made to your home safe using impressions taken during last month's charity gala. The necklace will disappear from your vault, appear in her possession, and be discovered during a carefully orchestrated search. Evelyn's eyes glittered with malicious anticipation. The dinner invitation had been extended that morning. Her voice dripping with false warmth as she'd played the role of the mother-in-law attempting reconciliation. Mark's relief had been palpable, and Christine's hopeful joy had made Evelyn want to vomit. Soon that joy would transform into terror, confusion, and ultimately the devastating realization that her husband didn't trust her. What about his technical background? Evelyn asked. Mark isn't going to simply accept digital evidence without verification. Which is why we're using his trust in technology against him. Chen's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. The bank records aren't just printed statements. They're accessible through the actual banking websites using hacked credentials we'll provide. The security footage isn't just files we hand him. It's retrievable from the building's own servers. Every piece of evidence will pass initial technical scrutiny because we've embedded it into the systems he trusts. This was the crown jewel of Chen's operation, not just creating false evidence, but ensuring that Mark's own investigation would lead him deeper into the trap. Every expert he consulted, every verification he demanded, every test he performed would confirm the manufactured narrative because Chen controlled the sources of information. The key is exploiting his core insecurity, Evelyn said, her voice soft with the kind of intimate cruelty that only family members can achieve. Mark has always believed he's fundamentally unworthy of unconditional love. He expects to be betrayed because he thinks betrayal is what he deserves. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where her son was probably holding his pregnant wife, reading stories to children who would never know their grandmother's love. The sight should have softened her heart, but Evelyn Fisher had excised sentimentality from her emotional repertoire decades ago. I remember when he was 8 years old, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of manipulation. He came home from school crying because some children had said his father only loved money, not his family. I told him that love was something you earned through worthiness, not something given freely. I taught him that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, that people would always disappoint him if he let them. Chen watched her with professional fascination. Most clients wanted to maintain some distance from the psychological damage they were orchestrating. Evelyn Fisher embraced it with the enthusiasm of an artist perfecting her masterpiece. The beautiful irony, she continued, is that I'll be destroying his marriage using the same lessons I taught him as a child. When he sees this evidence, he won't just doubt his wife. He'll doubt his own judgment, forever believing he deserved her love. The plan's elegance was truly breathtaking. Not only would it destroy Mark's marriage, but it would reinforce every negative belief he'd ever held about himself. He would end up alone, emotionally devastated, and psychologically primed to never risk genuine intimacy again. Evelyn would have her son back, broken but controllable, just the way she'd always preferred him. Timeline for implementation? She asked, already knowing the answer. 6 weeks from start to finish, Chen replied. Long enough to create believable patterns, short enough to strike while she's vulnerable with pregnancy hormones affecting her decision-making capabilities. Evelyn opened her purse and withdrew a cashier's check for $2.5 million, half the agreed-upon fee, routed through the Fisher Foundation's security consulting budget. As chairman of the foundation and controller of her late husband's trust, she had access to discretionary funds that weren't subject to public scrutiny or board oversight. "What's our exposure if this goes wrong?" she asked, though she already knew Chen's reputation for eliminating loose ends. "Minimal," he assured her. "The operatives have no knowledge of the ultimate client. The documentation trail leads back to a series of shell companies that exist only on paper. Even if everything unravels, there's no direct evidence connecting you to the operation." Chen had orchestrated similar campaigns for tech moguls whose children had fallen in love with inappropriate partners, oil executives whose heirs had shown environmental sympathies, pharmaceutical CEOs whose offspring had developed inconvenient consciences. The methodology was proven, the risks were manageable, and the success rate was 100%. "One final question," Evelyn said as she prepared to leave. "What happens to her afterward? The wife?" Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Our contract covers neutralizing the threat to your family unit. How that neutralization manifests depends on how she responds to the evidence. Some people accept defeat gracefully. Others require more permanent solutions." Evelyn nodded with the satisfaction of a woman who'd just purchased the perfect weapon. She gathered her purse and coat, preparing to return to her world of charity galas and board meetings, where she would play the role of the concerned mother-in-law, while her hired sociopath destroyed her son's happiness with surgical precision. "Mr. Chen," she said as she reached the door, "I want her completely destroyed. Not just divorced, broken. I want her to understand that crossing the Fisher family has consequences that last forever." "Understood, Mrs. Fisher. It will be our pleasure." As the door closed behind Evelyn, Chen returned to his computer and added a final note to Christine Spencer's file. "Subject requires complete psychological destruction. Recommend implementing contingency protocols for permanent resolution if primary objectives prove insufficient." The war for Mark Fisher's soul was about to begin, and his wife had no idea she was walking into a battle designed by a monster who'd given birth to him, raised him, and loved him just enough to destroy anyone who threatened her control over his life. Chapter 5. The Destruction of Love. The Fisher estate looked like something from a fairy tale that had taken a dark turn. Towering iron gates opened onto a circular driveway lined with ancient oaks, their bare November branches reaching toward a grey sky like skeletal fingers. The mansion itself was a monument to old money, 3 stories of limestone and marble that had housed generations of Fishers, each one adding their own layer to the family's legacy of wealth and ruthless ambition. Christine pressed her palms against her black maternity dress, trying to calm the nervous fluttering in her stomach that had nothing to do with the babies. At 6 months pregnant, she moved with the careful grace of a woman carrying precious cargo, her hand instinctively protective over her rounded belly. "Are you sure about this?" Mark asked for the 3rd time as they walked up the stone steps to the front door. His mother's sudden change of heart felt like a trap, but Christine's hopeful excitement had overridden his suspicions. "She's going to be their grandmother, Mark," Christine said softly. "These babies deserve to know their family, all of their family." The massive front door opened before they could knock, revealing Evelyn Fisher in all her cold glory. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, her silver hair swept into a perfect chignon that looked like it could deflect bullets. Her smile was porcelain perfect and just as fragile. "Mark, darling," she said, kissing the air near his cheek before turning to Christine with what might have passed for warmth if you didn't look too closely at her eyes. And Christine, you look radiant. Pregnancy suits you. Thank you, Mrs. Vischer, Christine replied, her voice steady despite the way Evelyn's gaze made her feel like a specimen under a microscope. Thank you for inviting us. Please call me Evelyn. We're family now, after all. The words tasted like ash in Evelyn's mouth, but she delivered them with Academy Award-worthy conviction. She led them through marble halls lined with portraits of dead fishes, all of whom seemed to stare down at Christine with disapproval. The dining room was an exercise in intimidation, a table that could seat 20, crystal chandeliers that caught the light like frozen fireworks, and place settings that probably cost more than Christine made in a month. Dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as polite conversation. Evelyn played the part of the gracious hostess perfectly, asking about Christine's work, expressing interest in the babies, even offering to throw a baby shower. But underneath the surface pleasantries, she was planting seeds of doubt with surgical precision. You know, Mark was such a sensitive child, Evelyn said as the first course was served, always so trusting, so eager to please. His father worried he was too soft for the business world. I think sensitivity is a strength, Christine said firmly. The world needs more men who aren't afraid to feel. Oh, absolutely, Evelyn agreed with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, though sometimes I worry people might take advantage of that sweetness. Mark has always been so generous with everything. His heart, his trust, his resources. The words were innocent enough on the surface, but they carried an undercurrent that made Mark's jaw tighten. This was his mother's specialty, planting poison with such subtlety that you almost didn't notice the sting until it was too late. Excuse me, Christine said as they finished the main course, one hand on her belly. Could I use the restroom? The babies are practicing soccer on my bladder. Of course, dear. It's just down the hall to the left. As soon as Christine left the room, Evelyn's mask slipped slightly. She seems nice, she said to Mark, the word nice carrying all the warmth of an Arctic wind. She's everything to me, Mark said quietly, his voice carrying a warning his mother chose to ignore. I'm sure she is, though I have to ask, and please don't take offense, but have you given any thought to a prenuptial agreement? I know it's a bit late now, but there are still ways to protect yourself. Mother, stop. I'm only thinking of your future, darling, and the baby's futures. You have responsibilities now, a legacy to protect. Meanwhile, Christine had found the bathroom and was splashing cool water on her face, trying to calm the anxiety that Evelyn's presence stirred in her chest. She loved Mark with every fibre of her being, but she wasn't naive about the world they came from. She'd seen the way wealth could corrupt, the way it could make people view others as commodities rather than human beings. As she walked back toward the dining room, her purse felt strangely heavy. She paused, frowning, and opened it to find a jewelry box she'd never seen before. Inside was a diamond necklace that caught the hallway light like captured stars, beautiful, expensive, and completely foreign. Her blood ran cold. Someone had put this in her purse while she was in the bathroom, but who and why? Find everything all right? Evelyn's voice came from behind her, and Christine spun around, the jewelry box still in her hands. This was in my purse, Christine said, holding up the necklace with trembling fingers. I've never seen it before. Evelyn's eyes widened in what looked like genuine shock, though it was nothing more than practiced theatre. That's my grandmother's Cartier necklace, she gasped. It's been in the family for generations. How did it... She stopped, her expression shifting to something that looked almost like sympathy. Oh, my dear. Oh, Christine. I didn't take this, Christine said, her voice rising with panic. Someone put it in my purse. I would never... Of course you wouldn't. Evelyn said soothingly, but her eyes had gone cold as winter stone. There must be some explanation, perhaps one of the staff, though that seems unlikely. They've all been with us for years. Mark appeared in the hallway, drawn by the sound of raised voices. "What's going on?" "Your wife seems to have accidentally taken something that belongs to the family," Evelyn said, her voice heavy with false regret. Mark looked at the necklace in Christine's hands, then at her face, and saw nothing but confusion and fear. "There's obviously been a mistake," he said firmly. "Obviously," Evelyn agreed, "though I have to say this is rather awkward. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Mark. Christine looks upset, and stress isn't good for the babies." But Christine wasn't going anywhere. She could see the wheels turning in Evelyn's head, could feel the trap closing around her like a vice. "This is deliberate," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "You put this in my purse." "Christine," Mark said, shocked by the accusation. "That's a very serious accusation, dear," Evelyn said sadly. "I understand you're upset, but to suggest that I would frame you, well, that's quite paranoid, don't you think?" The next few hours passed in a blur of accusations and denials. Evelyn called her head of security, who confirmed that the necklace had indeed been missing from the family vault for several days. She produced security footage showing the vault being accessed with Christine's fingerprints, footage that Chen's team had fabricated with the same careful precision as everything else. "I want to call the police," Christine said, desperation-making, her voice shake. "If I'm innocent, an investigation will prove it." "Of course," Evelyn agreed readily, "though I hate to put the family through such a scandal. Perhaps we could handle this privately. I'm sure Mark could arrange for the return of any other items that might have gone missing." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to consume everything. Mark stared at his wife, at his mother, at the evidence that seemed to damn the woman he loved more than life itself. "I think we should go," he said finally, his voice hollow. But Mark's world had been crumbling for weeks. The evidence hadn't appeared all at once. Evelyn had been too smart for that. It had started with small inconsistencies, questions that seemed innocent. A bank statement showing a withdrawal he didn't remember authorizing. Security footage of someone who looked like Christine entering his building at odd hours. Financial records that didn't quite add up. I wanted to believe there was an explanation, Mark said, his voice hollow. Each piece of evidence, I told myself there had to be a reason. But when I found the necklace in your purse tonight, God, Christine, it all suddenly made sense. The pregnancy timing, the quick marriage, the way you seemed to know exactly what to say to make me fall in love with you. You think I planned this? Christine's voice was deadly quiet. You think I researched your psychological profile and crafted a personality designed to manipulate you? I don't know what to think anymore, Mark admitted, and the honesty in his voice was somehow worse than any accusation. The woman I fell in love with would never steal from my family, but the evidence says she did. So either you're not who I thought you were, or I'm losing my mind. When they reached their apartment, Christine went straight to the bedroom and began pulling clothes from the closet, throwing them into a suitcase with violent efficiency. What are you doing? Mark asked. From the doorway. What does it look like? I'm leaving. Christine, wait, let's talk about this. We can figure it out. She whirled on him with such fury that he stepped back. Figure what out, Mark? Whether your pregnant wife is a criminal, whether the mother of your children is a gold-digging thief who planned this whole relationship to rob you blind? That's not what I said. It's what you're thinking. The words tore from her throat like pieces of her soul. I can see it in your eyes, the doubt, the suspicion. You're looking at me like I'm a stranger, like everything we've shared was a lie. I love you, Mark said desperately. God, Christine, I love you so much, but I need time to process this, to understand what happened tonight. Time to process whether you trust the woman you married? Christine's laugh was broken glass. Let me save you the trouble, Mark. If you have to think about whether I'm capable of stealing from your family, then you never really knew me at all. She zipped the suitcase closed with violent force. I won't stay where I'm not trusted. I won't raise our children in a house built on suspicion and doubt. Where will you go? Mark asked, panic creeping into his voice. That's not your concern anymore, Christine said, pausing at the bedroom door. When she looked back at him, her eyes held no warmth, no recognition, no love, only the cold finality of a woman whose heart had just been murdered. Congratulations, Mark. Your mother got exactly what she wanted. She destroyed us, and you let her. And then she was gone, leaving Mark alone in the wreckage of their life together, surrounded by the nursery they'd painted and the dreams they'd shared and the crushing realization that he might have just lost everything that mattered for the sake of evidence that felt true but tasted like lies. Chapter 6. Descent into Hell. The first night was a masterclass in the destruction of dignity. Christine sat in her Honda Civic in the parking lot of a 24-hour Walmart, engine running for heat, while November rain drummed against the windshield like bullets from a broken sky. The dashboard clock glowed 2:47 a.m. in cruel red numbers, marking another hour she'd survived in a world that had suddenly become hostile to her existence. Her phone sat silent on the passenger seat, the battery dead since yesterday. Mark's 43. Missed calls and 17 voicemails had drained it completely before she'd finally powered it off, unable to bear the sound of his voice, alternating between anger and desperation. The last message she'd heard before the phone died had been different, quieter, broken. Christine, please. I know you're hurt, but we can work through this. Come home. Please just come home. Home. The word felt like a dagger twisting between her ribs. Home had been their tiny apartment, with its cheerful yellow nursery, Mark's arms around her in the early morning light, his voice reading bedtime stories to their unborn sons. Now, home was nowhere, and she was a refugee in her own life, carrying his children while he chose to believe she was a criminal. At 5 months pregnant with twins, every position was agony. Her back ached constantly from the car's worn seats, her legs cramped from the limited space, and the babies pressed against her ribs with increasing urgency as they ran out of room. She discovered that the passenger seat reclined further than the driver's seat, giving her an extra few inches to stretch out. But sleep remained elusive. Every sound, a car door slamming, footsteps on asphalt, the hiss of air brakes from a late-night bus, made her heart race with the paranoid certainty that someone was coming to hurt her. Morning brought the harsh arithmetic of survival. Her savings account held exactly $2,847, the careful emergency fund she'd built during 5 years as a social worker, saving $50 here and there from a salary that barely covered her modest lifestyle. She'd been proud of that nest egg once, viewing it as proof of her responsibility and planning. Now it felt pathetically inadequate against the reality of being a pregnant woman with no address, no job, and no support system. The manager of the first motel she tried, a thin man with yellowed teeth and wandering eyes, quoted her $280 per week for a room that smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Cash only, he added, looking her up and down with the calculating gaze of a predator. And there's a security deposit for your condition. Sometimes pregnant ladies make messes. The security deposit was another $100, and Christine could read the subtext in his leer. She was vulnerable, alone, and desperate. Exactly the kind of tenant who might accept alternative payment arrangements when her money ran out. She left without taking the room, her skin crawling with the certainty that she'd narrowly avoided a different kind of hell. The second motel was cleaner, but more expensive. The third was cheaper, but located in a neighborhood where gunshots punctuated the night like deadly fireworks. By the fourth day, she'd given up on motels entirely, accepting that her Honda would be her bedroom for the foreseeable future. She developed a routine born of necessity and desperation. Mornings began at the McDonald's on Elm Street, where she could use the bathroom and buy a $1 coffee that entitled her to sit for an hour without being hassled. The manager, a tired-looking woman named Carmen, with kind eyes and calloused hands, never asked why Christine always paid in exact change or why she sometimes fell asleep at the corner table. "You doing okay, honey?" Carmen asked one particularly brutal morning when Christine couldn't stop her hands from shaking. "Just tired?" Christine managed, one hand protective over her growing belly. "The babies keep me up at night." Carmen nodded with the understanding of someone who'd seen enough hard luck stories to recognize one in progress. "First time?" "Twins," Christine whispered, and the word felt like a confession of the impossible task ahead of her. "You got family to help?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had already burned down her world. "No," Christine said finally. "Just me." Carmen disappeared into the back and returned with a bag containing 2 breakfast sandwiches and a large orange juice. "On the house," she said quietly, "for the babies." It was the first kindness Christine had experienced since leaving Mark, and she cried in the McDonald's bathroom for 20 minutes, overwhelmed by both gratitude and the crushing realization of how far she'd fallen. Job hunting while visibly pregnant and homeless was an exercise in systematic humiliation. The temp agencies took one look at her expanding belly and suddenly had no positions available. The retail stores needed employees who could stand for long periods and lift heavy objects, requirements that seemed specifically designed to exclude pregnant women. The office jobs required an address for background checks and a reliable phone number for contact. She finally found work through sheer desperation and a classified ad posted on a gas station bulletin board. A commercial cleaning needed overnight. Janitors, cash under the table, no questions asked, immediate start. The supervisor, Pete Kowalski, was a chain smoker with dead eyes who interviewed her in the parking lot of an office building at 10 p.m. "You sure you can handle the work?" he asked, taking in her condition with undisguised skepticism. "It ain't easy money." "I can handle it," Christine said, though she had no idea if that was true. 5 buildings, 6 nights a week. $40 a building if you finish everything on the list. Miss a night, miss a building, you're gone. No exceptions, no excuses. $240 a week. It wasn't enough to live on, but it was enough to buy food and gas and maybe, eventually, enough to escape this nightmare. "I'll take it." The work was brutal. Each building had 4 floors of offices that needed to be vacuumed, trash emptied, bathrooms scrubbed, and surfaces wiped down. At 5 months pregnant, bending to vacuum under desks sent lightning bolts through her lower back. The chemical smell of industrial cleaners made her nauseous, and the constant walking on concrete floors caused her ankles to swell until her shoes cut into her flesh like wire. By her 3rd week on the job, she'd lost weight everywhere except her belly. Her face was gaunt, her arms skeletal, while her stomach grew larger every day. She caught glimpses of herself in the bathroom mirrors she cleaned and barely recognized the hollow-eyed woman staring back. "You look like hell," Pete observed one night as she struggled to lift a trash bag that seemed to weigh 50 pounds. "Maybe you should think about finding a different line of work." "I need this job," Christine said quietly, her hands shaking. "From exhaustion. Yeah, well, I need workers who can actually work. You got maybe another week before I gotta replace you." The threat hung over her like a sword. Lose this job, and she'd have no income at all. No income meant no gas money, no food money, no hope of ever climbing out of the hole Mark's doubt had thrown her into. Her days became a careful choreography of survival. Sleep in the car from 6 a.m. to 11 a.m., when the parking lots filled with shoppers and she could blend into the crowd. Use the bathroom at different businesses throughout the day, McDonald's, Walmart, the library, never the same place twice in a row to avoid being labeled a vagrant. Spend afternoons at the public library where she could charge her phone, use the computer to apply for better jobs, and sit in air conditioning or heat, depending on the weather. The library became her sanctuary. In the quiet reading room, surrounded by other people's stories and dreams, she could almost pretend she was still the woman she'd been before, educated, employed, worthy of love and respect. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, never asked why Christine spent entire afternoons there or why she sometimes fell asleep in the comfortable chairs near the fiction section. But even the library couldn't protect her from the growing reality of her situation. At 6 months pregnant, she could no longer fit comfortably in the driver's seat of her Honda. Her belly pressed against the steering wheel, and getting in and out of the car became an exercise in physics and determination. The babies moved constantly now, their kicks and turns visible through her stretched clothing, reminding her that time was running out. The November cold was becoming December brutal, and her car's heater struggled to keep up with temperatures that dropped below freezing every night. She'd bought a sleeping bag from a thrift store, but it wasn't designed for automotive living. The windows fogged with her breath, creating condensation that froze into ice crystals by morning. Food became an increasingly complex equation. The McDonald's dollar menu could sustain her, but the babies needed nutrition she couldn't afford. She learned which grocery stores threw away expired produce, which restaurants had dumpsters with relatively clean leftovers, which food pantries didn't ask too many questions about addresses and employment status. At the Riverside Food Bank, a volunteer named James took one look at her condition and violation of their documentation required policy. "You know, sometimes the paperwork gets lost," he said quietly, loading a box with canned goods, pasta and prenatal vitamins someone had donated. Amazing how often that happens. But perhaps the cruelest element of her new reality was the isolation. Christine had always been surrounded by people. Children she advocated for, colleagues she collaborated with, friends she'd met for coffee and conversation. Now she was invisible, just another homeless person that society had learned to look through rather than at. She watched other people's lives through coffee shop windows and library computers, families eating dinner together, couples holding hands, children playing in parks with parents who would tuck them into warm beds at night. The normalcy she'd taken for granted now seemed impossibly distant, like watching television broadcasts from another planet. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to her belly during the worst moments, when despair threatened to drown her completely. "Mama's going to figure this out. We don't need anyone who doesn't trust us. We're strong enough on our own." But as December snow began to fall and her pregnancy entered its 7th month, strength felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. The babies were due in less than 10 weeks, and she had no plan, no resources, no safety net. For the first time since leaving Mark, real terror crept into her heart. What if love really wasn't enough? What if strength had limits? What if her children paid the price for her pride and their father's weakness? The snow fell harder, coating the city in pristine white that would soon turn to dirty slush. And Christine drove through the empty streets, carrying Mark's children and the shattered remains of dreams that had once seemed unbreakable, searching for a future she could no longer envision, but refused to stop fighting for. Chapter 7. The Hospital of Horrors. The contractions started at 3 in the morning, ripping through Christine's body like lightning splitting a tree. She was parked behind a 24-hour laundromat, her car windows fogged with her breath in the December cold, when the first wave of pain doubled her over the steering wheel. At 36 weeks pregnant with twins, technically full term for multiples, She'd been telling herself she had more time. Time to find a real place to live. Time to figure out how to raise 2 babies alone. Time to heal from the wound Mark had carved in her heart. Time, apparently, was up. "Not yet," she gasped, one hand clutching the door handle while the other pressed against her swollen belly. "Please, little ones, Mama needs more time." But Elijah and Isaiah had their own timeline, and as another contraction seized her body with merciless intensity, Christine realized this was happening whether she was ready or not. She fumbled for her phone, finally charged at a coffee shop earlier that day, and considered calling an ambulance. But ambulances meant questions, and questions meant revealing that she was the homeless pregnant wife of Mark Fisher, a story that would be in the tabloids before her children drew their first breath. With shaking hands, she started her Honda and began the agonizing drive to St. Catherine's Hospital, the public hospital where she decided to give birth because they couldn't legally turn away a woman in labor, regardless of her ability to pay. Every pothole sent shockwaves through her body, and by the time she reached the parking lot, the contractions were coming every 3 minutes. St. Catherine's emergency room at 4 in the morning was a circle of institutional hell that Dante had never imagined. The waiting area reeked of industrial disinfectant, fighting a losing battle against human desperation, vomit, urine, blood, and the particular smell of people who'd given up hope. Under flickering fluorescent lights that made everyone look corpse-pale, humanity's casualties waited for health care rationed by insurance cards and credit scores. Christine stumbled through the automatic doors, clutching her belly, leaving a trail of amniotic fluid on linoleum that had seen decades of other women's blood and tears. The receptionist, Brenda, according to her name tag, had the dead-eyed expression of someone who'd learned to view human suffering as paperwork to be processed. "Insurance and ID," Brenda demanded, without looking up from her computer screen, even as Christine doubled over with a contraction that made her scream loud enough to wake the dead. "I'm having my babies," Christine gasped. "Please, they're coming now." "Everyone thinks their baby is special," Brenda replied with practiced boredom, finally glancing up to take in Christine's appearance. Her eyes performed a rapid calculation. Black. Woman, no wedding ring visible. Clothes that suggested poverty rather than prosperity. No family or partner in sight. The diagnosis was immediate and damning. Charity case, probably another welfare mother looking for free medical care. "Fill these out," Brenda said, shoving forms across the desk. "Financial responsibility statements, emergency contact information, insurance verification, no exceptions." Christine stumbled through the automatic doors just as another contraction hit, causing her to collapse against the information desk. The receptionist, a woman whose name tag read Brenda and whose expression suggested she'd seen too much human misery to be moved by more, looked up with practiced irritation. "Fill out these forms," Brenda said, shoving a clipboard across the desk without looking at Christine's face. "Take a seat. Someone will call you." "I'm in labor," Christine panted, clutching the edge of the desk. "The babies are coming." "Insurance card and ID," Brenda demanded, finally looking up. Her eyes took in Christine's disheveled appearance, the torn dress, the absence of a partner or family member, and her expression shifted from irritation to outright disdain. "Medicaid? I don't have insurance right now," Christine admitted, the words tasting like shame in her mouth. Brenda's sigh was theatrical in its disgust. "Charity case. Great. Fill out the forms anyway. We'll need your financial information for the billing department." Another contraction hit, and Christine doubled over, her scream echoing through the waiting room. Several people looked up from their phones and magazines, but no one moved to help. In a place like St. Catherine's, other people's pain was background noise. "I need a doctor," Christine gasped when the pain receded enough for her to speak. "Please, Something's wrong. They're coming too fast. Look, honey, Brenda said, her voice dripping with false patience. Every woman thinks her labor is special. You fill out the forms, you wait your turn, and when we have a bed available, we'll see what we can do. That's how it works here. But I'm having twins, Christine pleaded. High-risk pregnancy. You need to stop making demands you can't afford to make. Brenda snapped. This isn't some fancy private hospital where you get a room with a view and gourmet meals. This is charity care, which means you get what we can give you when we can give it. Dr. Hassan emerged from the treatment area, his scrubs stained with evidence of a 12-hour shift in an understaffed emergency room. He was a good doctor trapped in a broken system, doing his best with impossible resources and bureaucratic constraints that turned medicine into an assembly line. "What's the situation?" he asked, approaching the desk. "Another uninsured pregnancy," Brenda said dismissively. "Claims she's having twins, but you know how they exaggerate." Dr. Hassan looked at Christine, really looked at her, and saw what the receptionist had missed. This wasn't a frequent flyer looking for attention or drugs. This was a woman in genuine medical crisis, her face grey with pain and exhaustion, her body clearly in advanced labor. "Ma'am, when did your contractions start?" he asked gently. "About 2 hours ago," Christine managed between pants. "They're coming every 2 minutes now. Something feels wrong. There's pressure, and I think..." She never finished the sentence. Another contraction seized her with such violence that she collapsed to the floor, amniotic fluid suddenly pooling beneath her as her water broke in a gush that soaked through her dress. "We need a gurney now," Dr. Hassan shouted, dropping to his knees beside Christine. "Call labor and delivery. Tell them we have an imminent twin delivery." But the damage was already done. 3 security guards appeared as if summoned by the commotion, their expressions suggesting they dealt with situations like this regularly. "Is she causing a disturbance?" asked the largest guard, a man whose name tag read Stevens and whose attitude suggested he viewed human suffering as a personal inconvenience. "She's in labor," Dr. Hassan said firmly. "We need to get her upstairs immediately." "With no insurance," Brenda added helpfully. "She'll probably stick us with a $50,000 bill." When Dr. Hassan tried to intervene, "We need to get her upstairs immediately," he was overruled by the triumvirate of bureaucratic cruelty that had infected the hospital like a cancer. "Policy is policy," Stevens said with the dead-eyed certainty of a man who'd learned to weaponize regulations. "No payment guarantee, no admission. We're not running a charity here." "This is a charity hospital," Dr. Hassan protested, his voice tight with controlled fury. "It's literally in our mission statement." "Charity for people who qualify," Brenda interjected, not looking up from her computer. "She hasn't filled out the financial hardship forms. For all we know, she's got money stashed somewhere and is trying to scam free care." The accusation was delivered with such casual cruelty that several waiting patients looked up in shock. Even in a place where human misery was processed like paperwork, the suggestion that a woman in active labor was faking her condition for free medical care crossed lines that most people still recognized as sacred. Stevens made the decision with the bureaucratic finality of a man who'd elevated heartlessness to an art form. "Look, we'll do the medical screening exam that's required by law, but after we stabilize you, you're getting transferred to County General. That's where charity cases go for delivery." "But the babies are coming now," Christine gasped. "Then we'll deliver them and transfer you afterward," Stevens said coldly. "Policy is you get emergency care to prevent death, then you go somewhere that can handle the financial burden of your situation." Dr. Hassan's face went white with fury. "You cannot transfer a woman who just gave birth. That's medical abandonment." "Watch us," Stevens replied. "Emergency stabilization, delivery if necessary, then immediate transfer. That's how we handle indigent cases." The cruelty wasn't in refusing care. They legally couldn't do that. The cruelty was in making it clear that Christine would receive the bare minimum required by law, then be dumped at an overwhelmed county facility the moment it was legally permissible. Christine's screams filled the emergency room as they carried her toward the exit, her body racked with contractions that were bringing her children into a world that had already rejected them. "Please," she sobbed, reaching toward Dr. Hassan as the guards manhandled her toward the doors. "Please don't let them do this. My babies." But Dr. Hassan was powerless, trapped by policies written by administrators who'd never held a dying woman's hand or delivered a baby in a parking lot. He could only watch in impotent fury as they prepared to dump a laboring mother onto the street like human garbage. Outside, the December cold hit Christine like a physical assault. Snow was beginning to fall, coating the parking lot in a pristine white that would soon be stained with blood if her children decided to be born on the asphalt. The guards deposited her next to her car with all the care they'd show discarded trash. "Good luck," Stephen said with mock sympathy. "Maybe try the county hospital. They're used to dealing with situations like yours." As they walked away, leaving her alone and laboring in a hospital parking lot, Christine felt something break inside her that had nothing to do with childbirth. This was what her life had become. Rejected by the man she loved, discarded by a system that measured human worth in insurance cards and credit scores, abandoned to give birth in the cold like an animal. But even as despair threatened to drown her, she felt her sons moving inside her, fighting to be born, despite the cruelty of the world waiting for them. She pressed her hands to her belly and made a promise that would sustain her through what was coming. "Mama's going to protect you," she whispered through tears that froze on her cheeks. "No matter what, Mama's going to make sure you know you're loved." The snow fell harder, and the hospital loomed above her like a monument to institutional cruelty. Somewhere inside, people were being healed, and lives were being saved. But out here in the cold, Christine labored alone, her screams lost in the wind while the city's indifference threatened to kill her children before they ever drew breath. Chapter 8. Rage Like Thunder. Mark Fisher had been many things in his 32 years: a dutiful son, a successful businessman, a broken man drowning in his own insecurities. But he had never been a force of nature, until the moment he heard his wife's agonized screams echoing through the emergency room doors of St. Catherine's Hospital, while bureaucrats debated whether her suffering was worth their time. He'd come to St. Catherine's for the dedication of the new pediatric wing, a $10 million donation that was supposed to make him feel better about the hole where his heart used to be. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was giving money to help children, while his own were being born somewhere unknown, carried by a woman he'd driven away with his weakness and doubt. The black Mercedes had just pulled into the executive parking area, past the media vans and red carpet that had been laid out for the dedication ceremony, when Mark heard the screaming. Even through the thick glass of the emergency room's automatic doors, even over the sound of his driver's radio and the distant hum of traffic, he recognized the voice that had whispered his name in passion and comfort, that had sung lullabies to their unborn children, that had told him he was worthy of love when he couldn't believe it himself. Recognition hit him like a physical blow, followed immediately by a terror so complete it stopped his breath. Every instinct screamed that Christine was in mortal danger, that his children were in mortal danger, that he was seconds away from losing everything that had ever mattered to him. "Stop the car!" Mark roared, lunging for the door handle before his driver had even come to a complete stop. He hit the pavement running, his $1,000 Italian shoes sliding on the wet asphalt, his custom-tailored suit jacket forgotten in the car. Nothing existed except the sound of Christine's agony and the need to reach her before what? Before they failed to save his children, before she died giving birth alone, before he lost the last chance to tell her he was sorry. Inside the emergency room, chaos reigned in the particular way that institutional indifference creates when confronted with human suffering. Christine lay on the floor near the reception desk, her body convulsing with contractions, while a security guard stood over her with the detached professionalism of a man who'd learned to view human misery as a maintenance problem. "Ma'am, you need to understand that this facility requires financial guarantees before we can provide non-emergency services," Stevens was saying in the tone of someone reading from a script. "Pregnancy is a natural condition, not a medical emergency. The babies are coming now," Christine screamed, her voice raw with pain and terror. "Please, I'm begging you, help me." "Policy is policy," Stevens replied with bureaucratic finality. "We'll provide emergency stabilization as required by law, then arrange transfer to a facility more appropriate for your circumstances." "Doctor." Hassan knelt beside Christine, his face flushed with anger and professional frustration. "This is insane," he said to Stevens. "She's in active labor with twins. Moving her now could kill her and the babies." "Not our problem," Stevens replied coldly. "Policy clearly states." That was the moment Mark Fisher exploded through the emergency room doors like an avenging angel clothed in righteous fury. "What the fuck is happening here?" The words erupted from him with such volcanic force that every conversation in the emergency room stopped. Patients looked up from their phones and magazines, nurses paused in their charting, and even the perpetually crying baby in the corner fell silent, as if recognizing the presence of something primal and terrifying. Mark stood in the doorway like a figure from mythology, 6 feet of barely controlled violence, his face contorted with rage that made him look capable of literally tearing the building apart with his bare hands. When his eyes found Christine on the floor, writhing in agony, while uniformed men stood over her discussing procedure, something inside him broke that had been holding civilization in place. "Is that my wife on the floor?" His voice carried across the room with the authority of Zeus hurling thunderbolts from Olympus, a sound so primal and filled with righteous fury that pigeons roosting on the hospital roof took flight in terror. Stevens turned toward this new threat with the practiced calm of a man who dealt with upset family members before. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice. This is a medical facility and—" "Lower my voice." Mark's response was so loud that car alarms began going off in the parking lot. "You're debating billing procedures while my pregnant wife screams on the floor, and you want me to lower my voice?" He began moving toward Stevens with the measured pace of a predator closing in for the kill, each step making the security guard back up despite himself. "Tell me I'm misunderstanding the situation," Mark said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. "Tell me you're not actually standing there discussing money while a woman in labor begs for help." "Hospital. Policy clearly states that non-emergency cases require financial guarantees," Stevens replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Non-emergency." Mark's roar made the windows rattle. "She's having twins in your fucking lobby. How is that not an emergency?" Christine cried out again, a sound that pierced the December air like a blade through silk, and Mark's attention snapped to her with laser focus. For a moment the fury was replaced by devastation as he saw what months of his doubt had cost her. She was skeletal except for her pregnant belly, her face gaunt with exhaustion and desperation, her clothes torn and dirty from living in her car. "Baby," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over her body like he'd lost the right to touch her. "Oh God, Christine, what have they done to you?" She looked up at him through tears of pain and exhaustion, and the expression on her face nearly stopped his heart. There was no relief at seeing him, no joy at being rescued. There was only the flat, dead look of a woman who had given up on being saved. "They said, I don't qualify for care," she gasped between contractions. "No insurance, no money, policy." Mark's Ed snapped up to where Stevens stood watching the scene with obvious discomfort. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet menace that had made Fortune 500 CEOs wet themselves during hostile takeover negotiations. "Did you just tell my wife that she doesn't qualify for medical care?" "Sir, we have procedures." "Procedures?" Mark exploded to his feet like a rocket, his face purple with rage. "You have procedures for letting pregnant women die in your lobby." He pulled out his phone with sharp, violent movements. "Let me help you understand your new reality. I'm Mark Fisher. Yes, that Mark Fisher. The man whose donation paid for half the equipment in this hospital. The man whose name is on the pediatric wing you're standing under. The man who could buy this entire fucking building with the money in my checking account." Stevens had gone pale, but he maintained his bureaucratic stance. "Mr. Fisher, I understand you're upset, but rules are rules. We can't make exceptions. Just because... Because what?" Mark stepped closer, and the security guard actually backed up. "Because my wife is black. Because she doesn't look like she belongs in your sterile little world of insurance cards and billing codes. Because you decided her life was disposable." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Around them, a crowd was gathering. Hospital staff, patients, visitors, all drawn by the spectacle of one of the city's most powerful men coming completely unhinged over systematic racism disguised as policy. "That's not what this is about." Stevens protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Mark's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "A woman in active labor with twins, crying for help, and you throw her out like garbage. Tell me, Stevens, what's your protocol for white women in Mercedes who go into labor without their insurance cards?" Behind them, Christine screamed again, and Mark heard something different in the sound, something urgent and desperate that made his blood freeze with terror. "Something's wrong," Dr. Hassan said, his hands examining Christine with professional urgency. "I can see the first baby's head. She's going to deliver right here, right now, whether you bastards like it or not." Mark spun back to Stevens with such fury that the man actually stumbled backward. "Do you hear that? My children are about to be born on your lobby floor because you're more concerned with billing than human life." He pulled out his phone again and began dialing with sharp, vicious motions. "I'm calling every news station in the state. I'm calling the medical board. I'm calling my lawyers. And I'm going to make sure the entire world knows that St. Catherine's Hospital throws laboring mothers into parking lots to protect their profit margins." The effect was immediate and electric. Stevens looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. Nurses began appearing from every direction, and somewhere in the administrative offices, phones started ringing as the hospital's public relations department prepared for the worst day in their history. "Mr. Fisher," Dr. Hassan called urgently, "I need you to stay calm. I'm going to deliver your babies right here, but I need you focused on your wife, not on revenge." But Mark was beyond calm, beyond reason, beyond anything except the primal need to make someone pay for what his wife had endured. He spun toward the growing crowd of hospital staff with the wild eyes of a man who discovered the depths of institutional cruelty. "Listen to me, all of you!" His voice boomed across the emergency room like Judgment Day. "This is what your hospital does to pregnant women who can't pay. This is how you treat human beings who come to you for help." He pointed at Stevens with a finger that shook with barely contained violence. "This man, this fucking monster, was going to let my wife give birth in a parking lot because she doesn't have the right insurance card. He was going to let my children die because their mother couldn't prove she was worth saving." The crowd pressed closer, some filming with their phones, others simply staring in shock at the raw display of fury and pain. Mark turned in a slow circle, his eyes wild with rage and grief, making sure everyone could see the devastation their policies had caused. "Her name is Christine Fisher," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "She's 28 years old. She's A social worker who's devoted her life to protecting children. And she's been living in her car for 2 months because I was too much of a coward to trust the woman I married. The confession came out like blood from a wound, and Mark felt something break inside his chest as he said the words. She came here, tonight dying and alone, because I chose to believe lies about her instead of fighting for our family. And your people, decided her life wasn't worth saving because she couldn't pay. Sirens wailed in the distance, ambulances, police, news crews, all responding to the chaos that one man's fury had unleashed. But Mark was beyond caring about consequences or public relations or anything except the woman giving birth on a hospital floor while he stood helpless and broken. I don't care how much money it costs, he said to anyone who would listen. I don't care about policies or procedures or any of your bureaucratic bullshit. If my wife or my children die because of what happened here tonight, I will spend every dollar I have making sure this hospital burns to the ground. Dr. Hassan looked up from where he was delivering the first baby. Sir, I need you to focus. Your son is about to be born. Mark dropped to his knees beside Christine, his hands shaking as he reached for her. I'm here now, baby. I'm not going anywhere, and I swear to you, on the lives of our children, these people are going to pay for what they've done. But even as he made his promises, even as his children prepared to enter a world that had already tried to reject them, Mark knew that some kinds of damage couldn't be undone by money or power or rage. Some trust, once broken, could never be rebuilt, and some love, once poisoned by doubt, could never be purified again. Chapter 9. The Unraveling Truth. The labor and delivery room at St. Catherine's had been transformed into something resembling a war zone command center. News crews gathered outside like sharks scenting blood. Hospital administrators huddled in emergency meetings, and Mark Fisher paced like a caged predator while his wife labored with the assistance of Dr. Hassan and 2 nurses who kept shooting. Nervous glances at the man whose donation had funded half their equipment. Contractions are 2 minutes apart, Dr. Hassan announced, checking the monitors that tracked the twins' heartbeats. Both babies are in optimal position. Mrs. Fisher, you're doing beautifully. Christine gripped the bed rails as another contraction seized her, her face a mask of pain and exhaustion that couldn't hide the emotional devastation underneath. She'd been laboring for 3 hours since Mark's explosive arrival, her body pushed beyond its limits by months of stress, malnutrition, and the trauma of being treated like human refuse. Don't, she said quietly, when Mark tried to take her hand during a particularly brutal contraction. The words hit him like physical blows, reminding him that despite his rage and promises of protection, she hadn't forgiven him. She might never forgive him. Christine, please, Mark said desperately, his voice hoarse from shouting but no less intense for it. I know you're angry, but... Angry. She turned her head to look at him, and the expression in her eyes was worse than fury. It was complete indifference. I'm not angry, Mark. Anger requires caring, and I'm done caring about you. The heart monitor beeped steadily, tracking not just the baby's vitals, but the death of everything they'd once shared. Mark felt each word like a nail in the coffin of their marriage, but he couldn't stop trying to reach her, couldn't stop hoping that love might somehow survive the wreckage of trust. Between contractions, Mark's phone buzzed incessantly with messages from his security team, his lawyers, and his personal assistant. But one name made his heart stop: James Rodriguez, the forensic specialist he'd hired in a moment of desperate clarity 3 days ago when guilt had finally overcome stubborn pride. Mr. Fisher, one of the nurses said hesitantly, there's a man outside who says he has urgent information about your legal situation. Something about forensic evidence that can't wait? Mark looked at Christine, who was focused entirely on breathing through another contraction. Her message was clear. Deal with your problems, but don't expect her to care about the outcome. Send him in. Mark said, never taking his eyes off his wife. James Rodriguez entered the room carrying a briefcase and wearing the grim expression of a man who'd discovered something that would change lives forever. He was the kind of forensic specialist who charged $3,000 an hour and earned every penny of it. Former FBI, former military intelligence, the man wealthy people called when they needed to know whether their world was built on lies. "Mr. Fisher," Rodriguez said without preamble, his voice cutting through the medical bustle like a knife through silk. "Everything your mother showed you was fabricated. Every piece of evidence, every document, every witness statement, it's all fake." The room went silent except for the steady beeping of monitors and Christine's labored breathing. Mark felt the world tilt on its axis as Rodriguez opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet loaded with technical analysis that would destroy everything Evelyn Fisher had built. "The security footage showing your wife entering your building is a deep fake," Rodriguez continued, pulling up split-screen images that showed the original footage alongside the fabrication. "Sophisticated technology, but not perfect. The facial mapping has digital artifacts invisible to casual observation, but obvious under microscopic analysis." He swiped to another screen showing frame-by-frame breakdowns of lighting, shadow patterns, and pixel density variations. "The perpetrators used military-grade software to replace an actress's face with your wife's, but they made 3 critical errors. First, the pixel density around facial edges doesn't match the original footage's compression algorithm. Second, the eye movement patterns are too regular. They used motion capture data instead of natural blinking reflexes. Third, the shadow. Mapping is wrong for your building's lighting system." Mark stared at the technical evidence with the growing horror of a man watching his entire reality collapse. "How long have you known this?" "I completed the analysis 4 days ago," Rodriguez replied grimly. "I called your office immediately, but your assistant said you were unavailable and taking no calls related to personal matters. I've been trying to reach you ever since." 4 days, Mark whispered, the words tasting like poison. "I could have found her 4 days ago." Rodriguez brought up another screen, showing side-by-side bank records. The ones Evelyn had presented alongside the authentic versions he'd retrieved through his FBI connections. The financial documents were masterpieces of forgery, but they have the same fatal flaw as most fabricated evidence. They're too perfect. Real financial records have inconsistencies, minor errors, timestamp variations. These were all generated using the same template algorithms on the same date. 3 weeks after your wife left you. The revelation hit Mark like a physical blow. While Christine had been sleeping in her car, while she'd been cleaning office buildings to survive, while their children had been developing in a body racked by stress and malnutrition, he'd been sitting in his office, staring at evidence that hadn't even existed when she'd walked out of their life. The jewelry fingerprints were transferred using a technique called phantom lifting, Rodriguez continued remorselessly. Someone with access to surfaces your wife had touched used heat transfer methods to apply her prints to the necklace after the fact. We found residue from the transfer medium under microscopic analysis, specifically silicone polymers used in intelligence operations. Mark's legs gave out, and he collapsed into the chair beside Christine's bed. "Oh, God," he whispered. "Oh, God. What have I done?" "There's more," Rodriguez said, his voice gentle but relentless. "The investigation firm your mother recommended? They're not legitimate forensics experts. They're a front company owned by David Chen, a specialist in what he calls reputation management, systematic character assassination disguised as legitimate investigation." The tablet screen showed corporate records, bank transfers and phone logs that painted a picture of conspiracy so vast and calculated that Mark couldn't breathe. Chen has conducted similar operations for at least 12 other wealthy families whose children made inappropriate romantic choices. The methodology is always the same: create overwhelming false evidence, then guide the target's investigation to confirm the fabricated narrative. How much? Mark's voice was barely audible. Your mother paid $4.7 million for this operation, Rodriguez said, producing financial records that Chen had provided as part of his immunity deal. Bank transfers, payment schedules, even receipts for the specialized equipment used to create the deepfake footage. She funded this destruction of your marriage through the Fisher Foundation's security consulting budget. The room spun around Mark as the full scope of his mother's betrayal crystallized. She hadn't just lied to him. She'd constructed an entire false reality designed to exploit every insecurity he'd ever confessed to her, every weakness she'd helped create during 32 years of psychological manipulation. Mr. Chen is currently in federal custody, Rodriguez continued. He's cooperating fully with authorities in exchange for immunity from prosecution. He's provided detailed records of the entire operation, including audio recordings of his conversations with your mother. Rodriguez pressed play on his tablet, and Evelyn Fisher's voice filled the room with crystal clarity. I want her completely destroyed, not just divorced, broken. I want her to understand that crossing the Fisher family has consequences that last forever. Mark made a sound that wasn't quite human. Part scream, part sob, part the death rattle of everything he'd believed about his family and himself. Christine looked at him through her pain, and for a moment her mask of indifference slipped, revealing something that might have been pity. She's my mother, Mark whispered, the words torn from his throat like pieces of his soul. She raised me. She told me she loved me, and she destroyed us because she couldn't control you anymore. Christine finished, her voice steady despite the contractions that were coming faster now. Because you chose me over her, and she'd rather see you destroyed than happy without her approval. Dr. Hassan looked up from his monitoring equipment. Mrs. Fisher, it's time. The first baby is crowning. For the next 20 minutes, the room filled with the primal sounds of new life entering the world, while Mark sat broken beside his wife's bed, drowning in the knowledge of everything he'd lost through his own weakness and doubt. Christine pushed with strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond physical endurance, her face transformed by determination and love for the children she'd protected even when their father had failed them. It's a boy, Dr. Hassan announced, holding up a tiny, perfect human being who filled the room with his indignant cries. Elijah, Christine whispered, through tears of exhaustion and joy as they placed her son on her chest for the first time. Mark reached out instinctively, wanting to touch his child, but Christine's look stopped him cold. Don't, she said quietly. You forfeited that right when you chose doubt over love. The words were spoken without malice, but they carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Mark fell to his knees beside the bed, his hands shaking. As he stared at the son he might never be allowed to hold. The second birth came quickly after the first. Isaiah emerged into the world with the same healthy cries as his brother, his tiny fists waving as if he were already fighting the injustices that had marked his entrance into life. 2 perfect boys, Dr. Hassan said with genuine joy. Excellent. Size for 36 weekers, 5 pounds 2 ounces and 4 pounds 15 ounces. Strong lungs, excellent reflexes, no signs of respiratory distress. They're remarkably healthy, considering everything they've been through. Mark stared at his sons. These perfect, innocent beings who'd been conceived in love, but born into the wreckage of broken trust. They were beautiful, tiny versions of both their parents, and they would grow up knowing that their father had failed them before they were even born. Christine, Mark began, his voice breaking as he looked at her holding their children. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know I destroyed everything we had, But please, let me try to make this right. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of being their father." She looked at him for a long moment. This broken man who'd chosen fear over faith, who'd let his mother's poison corrupt the purest thing he'd ever known. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every sleepless night in her car, every humiliation she'd endured, every moment she'd wondered if love was real or just another lie people told themselves. "You can't make this right, Mark," she said with devastating gentleness. "Some things once broken can't be fixed. Some trust once lost can never be rebuilt. You had one chance to choose between your mother's lies and your wife's love, and you chose wrong." She kissed each baby's forehead with infinite tenderness, her tears falling on their perfect faces. "These boys will know they're loved, they'll know they're wanted, and they'll know that their mother never stopped fighting for them, even when the whole world turned against her." Rodriguez cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Fisher, there's one more thing you should know. Your mother is being arrested as we speak. Federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and about 12 other felonies. She'll likely spend the rest of her life in prison." Mark felt nothing at the news. No satisfaction, no grief, just the hollow emptiness of a man who'd lost everything that mattered in pursuit of a truth that had come too late. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in pristine white that would soon be stained with the dirt of real life. Inside, 2 boys drew their first breaths while their father learned the hardest lesson of all, that some mistakes cost everything, and love without trust is just another word for heartbreak that echoes through generations. Chapter 10. The Final Rejection. 3 days had passed since the twins' birth, 3 days during which Mark had haunted the hospital corridors like a ghost seeking redemption that would never come. He'd exposed his mother's conspiracy to the world. David Chen's testimony had destroyed Evelyn Fisher's reputation and would likely send her to prison, but justice felt hollow when weighed against what he'd lost. The private room he'd arranged for Christine was filled with flowers he'd sent and gifts for the babies she'd refused to acknowledge. She sat by the window in a soft blue robe, Elijah sleeping peacefully in her arms, while Isaiah dozed in the bassinet beside her. The morning light painted her in shades of gold and sorrow, making her look like a painting of divine motherhood, touched by human tragedy. "The charges against my mother will be filed this afternoon," Mark said from the doorway where he'd been standing for the past 10 minutes, afraid to enter uninvited. "Fraud, conspiracy, forgery. She'll never be able to hurt us again." Christine didn't look up from Elijah's sleeping face. "Us," she said quietly. "There is no us, Mark. There's me and my sons, and there's you learning to live with the consequences of your choices." "They're my sons, too," he said desperately, taking a step into the room. "DNA doesn't change just because I failed as a husband. I want to be part of their lives. I want to support them, love them, be the father they deserve." "The father they deserve?" Christine's laugh was soft and bitter. "The father they deserved would have trusted their mother. The father they deserved would have protected his family instead of believing lies about them. You forfeited the right to be the father they deserve." Mark moved closer, his hands shaking with the need to touch his children, to hold them, to somehow bridge the chasm his weakness had created. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But I can change. I can be better. Please, Christine, don't punish them for my mistakes." For the first time since he'd entered the room, she looked at him directly. Her eyes held a depth of pain that made him want to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness until his voice gave out. "You want to know the difference between us, Mark?" Christine's voice was steady as steel, each word chosen with surgical precision. "When your mother showed me that evidence, when she painted me as a thief and a liar, my first instinct was to protect you. Even knowing she was lying, even seeing her manipulation, my immediate thought was, how can I prove my innocence to the man I love? But when she showed you the same lies about me, your first instinct was to believe them. She moved to the window, her silhouette outlined against the morning light like a portrait of strength forged in fire. You didn't question whether the evidence could be fake. You didn't demand to know why your mother suddenly had access to security footage from your building. You didn't wonder why a woman you claimed to know intimately would suddenly develop the skills and connections needed for international financial fraud. Mark started to speak, but she held up a hand that silenced him more effectively than a slap. I know what you're going to say, that the evidence was convincing, that anyone would have been fooled. But that's not true, is it, Mark? Because I wasn't fooled. Dr. Hassan wasn't fooled when he saw me in that hospital parking lot. Even your forensic expert wasn't fooled when he actually looked at the evidence with an objective eye. Her words landed like surgical strikes, each one finding the exact center of his guilt. The only person who was fooled was the one person who should have known better, the man who claimed to love me, who had seen me at my most vulnerable, who had watched me care for broken children and fight for the powerless. You were fooled because some part of you wanted to be fooled. I loved you, Mark whispered, the past tense hanging between them like a death certificate. I loved you more than I thought it was possible to love another human being. I know you. It did, Christine said, and for a moment her voice softened with what might have been sympathy. But love without trust is just possession with prettier words. You loved me, but you didn't trust me. You loved me, but you didn't know me. Because if you had truly known me, known my heart, my character, my soul, you never could have believed I was capable of betraying you. She stood and moved to the bassinet, settling Elijah beside his brother with infinite gentleness. Both boys slept peacefully, unaware that their parents were saying goodbye to a future that would never exist. I gave you everything, she continued, her back to him as she adjusted the baby's blankets. My heart, my body, my dreams, my trust. I made myself vulnerable to you in ways I'd never been vulnerable to anyone. I let you see my fears, my insecurities, my deepest hopes. And when the first real test came, you threw all of that away for evidence that any reasonable person would have questioned. The evidence was convincing, Mark said weakly. To someone who wanted to be convinced, Christine replied, turning to face him. To someone who never really believed he deserved to be loved unconditionally. Your mother knew exactly what she was doing. She fed the monster you've carried inside yourself since childhood, the one that whispers you're not worthy of genuine affection. Mark felt tears streaming down his face, but he made no move to wipe them away. Then help me kill that monster. Help me become the man you fell in love with. I can't, Christine said simply. I can't fix what's broken in you, Mark. Only you can do that. And I can't risk my children's emotional security while you figure out how to love yourself enough to trust in love from others. She moved to the window, looking out at the city where they'd fallen in love in a coffee shop that now felt like a lifetime ago. Do you know what the worst part is? It's not that you doubted me. It's not even that you threw me out of our home while I was carrying your children. The worst part is that you robbed our sons of the father they could have had. I can still be that father, Mark pleaded. No, she said with devastating finality. You can't, because every time you look at them, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember that you failed them before they were even born. And every time they look at you, I'll remember that their father was capable of believing their mother was a criminal. She walked to the small closet and pulled out a suitcase, the same one she'd packed the night she left him. I'm taking my sons, and we're leaving the city. I have a job offer in Portland, social services, good benefits, a chance to start fresh, where no one knows our story. You can't take them away from me, Mark said, panic rising in his voice. I have rights. I'm their father. Yes, you are, Christine agreed, and if you truly love them, you'll let them go. You'll let them grow up without the shadow of this heartbreak hanging over them. You'll let them believe their father was a good man who just couldn't be part of their lives. instead of the truth, that he was a man who loved them but couldn't trust their mother. She zipped the suitcase closed with the same decisive motion she'd used 8 months ago, and Mark felt his world ending all over again. "What about my rights as their father?" he asked desperately. "What about their rights to grow up feeling secure and loved?" she countered. "What about their right to not spend their childhood wondering why daddy doesn't live with mommy? What about their right to not inherit your trust issues along with your eye color?" Mark fell to his knees beside the bassinet, looking at his sleeping sons through a haze of tears. They were perfect, tiny fingers curled into fists, peaceful expressions that promised the men they might become. In Elijah's face, he saw Christine's strength, and in Isaiah's, he saw his own stubbornness. They were the best of both their parents, and they deserved better than the wreckage their parents had made of love. "I'll send money," he said brokenly, "for their education, their needs, whatever they require. I'll make sure they never want for anything." "I know you will," Christine said softly, "because despite everything, you're not a cruel man, Mark. You're just a broken one. And maybe someday, when you've learned to trust yourself enough to trust others, you'll understand why I had to choose them over you." She picked up Elijah while a nurse came to help with Isaiah and the bags. At the door, she paused and looked back at Mark, still kneeling beside the empty bassinet. "I want you to know," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears, "that what we had was real. The love, the joy, the dreams we shared, all of it was real. Your mother's lies didn't create our love, and they didn't destroy it either. Your doubt destroyed it. Your inability to trust destroyed it. Remember that when you're tempted to blame her for everything you lost." "Christine," he called as she reached the hallway. She stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for all of it. For not being the man you deserved, for not protecting our family, for failing you when you needed me most. I'm sorry. No," she said without looking back, "and I forgive you. But forgiveness doesn't undo the damage, and it doesn't change my decision. Goodbye, Mark." And then she was gone, taking his children and his future with her, leaving him alone in a hospital room filled with the ghosts of what might have been. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, indifferent to the fact that a man's world had just ended with the closing of a door. Mark stayed on his knees until the sun set, surrounded by unopened gifts and wilted flowers, learning the hardest truth of all, that some kinds of love survive everything except the absence of trust. And some mistakes echo through generations, shaping the lives of children who will never understand why their father chose doubt over devotion.